You don't belong in first class. This ticket must be fake.
Victoria Ashworth didn't whisper those words. She announced them like policy, her voice cutting through the bustling departure gate at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at Dr. Marcus Thompson, who stood holding his boarding pass briefcase in hand, dressed in a simple navy polo and khaki pants. The words hit the air like a slap, and suddenly the busy gate area fell into an uncomfortable hush. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes stared, and at the center of it all stood a black man who had just been publicly accused of fraud for the crime of holding a first-class boarding pass. Before we dive deeper into this story, I need to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. And if you believe dignity shouldn't depend on appearance, hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, you're going to want to share this with everyone you know. Now, let's rewind to how this moment started. Dr. Marcus Thompson, 35 years old, had been moving through O'Hare with the practiced efficiency of a man who spent half his life in airports. As the founder and CEO of BioNova Therapeutics, one of the fastest-growing biotechnology companies in America, he was no stranger to high-stakes travel. But today was different. Today carried the weight of everything he had built over the past decade. He was flying to Los Angeles for a meeting that would change his life forever. At exactly 3 p.m. Pacific time, he would sit across from the executives of Medcore Industries to finalize a $2.8 billion merger. This wasn't just a business deal, it was the culmination of years of research development and dreams. It was the validation of every late night in the lab, every rejected grant proposal, every investor who had looked at his young face and decided to bet on someone else. BioNova Therapeutics had developed revolutionary gene therapies that were changing the landscape of rare disease treatment. The Medcore merger would provide the distribution network and manufacturing capabilities to bring these treatments to patients worldwide. Lives were literally hanging in the balance. But Marcus had learned long ago that success came with a target on your back. The higher you climbed, the more people wanted to see you fall. So, today, he had made a deliberate choice. No entourage, no designer suit, no obvious displays of wealth. Just a man in casual clothes carrying a briefcase trying to blend into the crowd. He had dressed down intentionally. The navy polo was from Target, the khaki pants were off the rack from a department store, and his black leather shoes, while comfortable, were nothing special. He wanted to travel without drawing attention to avoid the assumptions and expectations that came with success. But what he hadn't counted on was how that same strategy would make him a target for a different kind of assumption altogether. The briefcase he carried contained more than just documents. Inside were the merger agreements, financial projections, and regulatory approvals that represented the work of hundreds of employees and the hopes of thousands of patients. The responsibility was enormous, and missing this meeting wasn't just unacceptable, it was catastrophic. Marcus had checked in online, confirmed his first-class seat, and even received the automatic text messages confirming his flight details. Skyline Airways Flight 447 departing Chicago O'Hare at 11:45 a.m., arriving at LAX at 1:30 p.m. local time. With a 3-hour time difference, it would give him exactly 90 minutes to get from the airport to the Medcore offices in Century City. Tight, but doable. He had grabbed a coffee from the Starbucks near security, reviewing his presentation notes one final time, when a hurried businessman, eyes glued to his phone, slammed directly into him. The collision was sudden and violent. Hot coffee exploding across Marcus's chest, seeping through the fabric of his polo shirt. The businessman barely paused, muttering a half-hearted watch it before disappearing into the crowd. Marcus stood there for a moment, feeling the hot liquid burn against his skin. The stain was prominent and ugly, spreading across his chest like an accusation. He grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby kiosk and dabbed at the damage, but it was useless. The polo shirt now bore the unmistakable mark of spilled coffee, and there was no time to find a replacement. He checked his watch. Boarding would begin in 15 minutes. He would have to arrive at his billion-dollar meeting wearing a stained shirt and smelling like a coffee shop. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Success, he had learned, wasn't about perfect circumstances. It was about adapting when everything went wrong. Victoria Ashworth commanded Gate B-23 like a general surveying her troops. At 42, she had been with Skyline Airways for 15 years, working her way up from ticket agent to senior gate supervisor. She wore the promotion-like armor, her tailored uniform fitted to accentuate her curves, her blonde hair styled in a perfect bob that never seemed to move despite the chaos of air travel. Her red lipstick was applied with precision, and her jewelry, while tasteful, was expensive enough to make a statement. She had seen it all in 15 years of airline work. The entitled passengers who demanded upgrades they hadn't paid for. The frequent flyers who thought status gave them the right to break rules. The fraud attempts, the fake tickets, the people who thought they could talk their way into seats they couldn't afford. And she had developed a sixth sense for spotting trouble before it started. That sense was telling her something was wrong the moment she saw Marcus approach the gate area. He didn't look like the typical first-class passenger. Where were the designer clothes? The expensive luggage, the confident swagger of someone accustomed to premium service. Instead, she saw a black man in casual clothes with a prominent stain on his shirt looking, in her mind, exactly like someone who might try to scam his way into a better seat. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she watched him take his place in the priority boarding line. Her mind was already working, already building the case for why this didn't feel right. The stained shirt, the cheap clothes, the way he kept checking his phone nervously. Everything about him screamed wrong place, wrong time, wrong class. She had built her reputation on maintaining the standards that made Skyline Airways a premium carrier. Her supervisors respected her for her ability to spot problems before they became incidents. Her colleagues knew she didn't tolerate nonsense, and her passengers, the real passengers who belonged in first class, appreciated that she protected their exclusive environment from those who would try to infiltrate it. As boarding time approached, Victoria positioned herself behind the podium like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. She straightened her jacket, checked her lipstick in the reflection of her computer monitor, and prepared to do what she did best: maintain order and protect standards. The gate area around B-23 was a microcosm of American air travel. Families with crying children struggled with oversized carry-on bags. Business travelers typed furiously on laptops trying to squeeze in one more email before takeoff. Elderly couples clutched their boarding passes like lifelines, afraid of missing their connection. And scattered throughout the crowd were the first-class passengers, easily identifiable by their confident posture and expensive accessories. Among this crowd stood Carlos Martinez, a young gate agent who had been working for Skyline Airways for just 6 months. At 23, he was still learning the ropes, still trying to figure out how to balance company policy with basic human decency. He had noticed the exchange of glances between Victoria and the black passenger in the priority line, and something in his stomach twisted with unease. Carlos had grown up in a Latino family where respect was earned through character, not clothing. His grandmother had cleaned houses for wealthy families his entire childhood, coming home with stories about how she was treated by people who judged her worth based on her appearance. He had promised himself he would never become that kind of person. Never forget where he came from. Never let a uniform change who he was inside. But jobs were hard to come by, and the airline industry offered steady employment with benefits. His family was proud of his position, even if it meant sometimes having to enforce policies that didn't always feel right. He watched Victoria's face as she stared at the man in line, and he recognized the look. It was the same expression his grandmother had described seeing in the faces of those who employed her but never quite saw her as human. Also, in the boarding area was Robert Hayes, a white passenger in his mid-30s who worked as a freelance journalist. He had developed a habit of documenting interesting moments during his travels, and his phone was never far from his hand. Something about the tension he sensed at the gate caught his attention. The way the gate supervisor was staring at one particular passenger. The uncomfortable energy that seemed to be building even before boarding had begun. Robert had built a significant following on social media by sharing authentic moments of human interaction, both positive and negative. He believed in the power of documentation, the way that recording truth could force accountability in situations where power was being abused. His finger hovered over the record button on his phone app, waiting to see if his instincts were correct about what was about to unfold. Jennifer Walsh, a flight attendant with 12 years of experience, stood near the gate preparing for the boarding process. She had seen Victoria in action before, and generally respected her no-nonsense approach to passenger management. Jennifer believed in supporting her colleagues and maintaining the hierarchy that kept the airline industry functioning. But lately, she had begun to notice patterns in how certain passengers were treated differently, and the observations were making her uncomfortable. Michael Bradford, the shift supervisor, was reviewing the flight manifest when he noticed Victoria's focused attention on the boarding area. Michael had worked his way up through the ranks over 2 decades, and he trusted Victoria's judgment. She had a reputation for preventing problems before they escalated, and her track record spoke for itself. If she sensed an issue, he was prepared to support her decisions. The announcement came over the gate area speakers. We will now begin boarding Skyline Airways Flight 447 to Los Angeles. We welcome passengers requiring special assistance and families with small children. Victoria's voice carried across the space with practiced authority, but there was something cold underneath the professional tone. Her eyes remained fixed on Marcus as the first wave of passengers approached the gate. She was waiting, watching, preparing for what she was convinced would be a confrontation. Marcus checked his boarding pass one more time. Seat 2A, first class. Paid for with his personal credit card 3 weeks ago when the meeting was confirmed. Everything was legitimate, everything was in order, and everything was about to go very, very wrong. The stage was set for a collision between assumption and reality, between prejudice and truth, between a woman who thought she knew who belonged where, and a man who was about to prove that appearances can be devastatingly deceiving. As the boarding process continued, the energy at Gate B23 grew more tense. Victoria continued her surveillance. Carlos shifted uncomfortably behind the desk. Robert's finger hovered over his phone's record button, and Marcus moved closer to what would become the most humiliating and transformative moment of his professional life. None of them knew that in exactly 6 hours and 47 minutes, Marcus would be standing in a Los Angeles boardroom closing the biggest deal in biotechnology history, while Victoria would be sitting in an unemployment office trying to explain how a 30-second decision had destroyed a 15-year career. But first, they all had to live through the next 10 minutes. We are now ready to begin boarding for first-class passengers on Skyline Airways Flight 447 to Los Angeles. Victoria's announcement echoed through the gate area, and Marcus stepped forward with his boarding pass ready. He had made this walk thousands of times before, the simple routine approach to an airline gate agent for the mundane process of boarding a flight. But today something was different. Today he could feel eyes on him in a way that made his skin crawl. Victoria's gaze was predatory, assessing judgmental. She looked at him the way a security guard might examine a shoplifter searching for signs of deception before any crime had been committed. Marcus had felt this look before. In high-end stores where he was followed by suspicious staff, in restaurants where hostesses questioned his reservations, in boardrooms where his presence was initially mistaken for the janitor rather than the executive. He approached the podium and extended his phone, the boarding pass QR code clearly displayed on the screen. "Good morning," he said politely, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone accustomed to professional interactions. Victoria didn't return the greeting. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her nose wrinkling as if she had detected something unpleasant. "Sir," she said, her voice loud enough to carry to nearby passengers, "have you been drinking this morning?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around him, conversations stopped, heads turned. The normal bustle of a departure gate suddenly focused on him with uncomfortable intensity. He felt the familiar flush of anger and embarrassment creeping up his neck, but he forced his voice to remain level. "I'm sorry." "What did you say?" Victoria's voice grew louder, more theatrical. I asked if you've been drinking alcohol this morning. I can smell it from here. She gestured toward the coffee stain on his shirt with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Other passengers in line shifted uncomfortably, some moving slightly away from Marcus, as if proximity might implicate them in whatever drama was unfolding. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. Marcus felt the crushing weight of every stereotype, every assumption, every prejudiced thought that had been directed at successful black men throughout history. Here he stood holding a legitimate first-class boarding pass, dressed casually but respectably, and he was being accused of public intoxication based on nothing more than the color of his skin and a coffee stain on his shirt. "That's coffee," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "A man bumped into me near security and spilled his drink. I haven't had a drop of alcohol. I'm traveling to an important business meeting." Victoria scanned his boarding pass with exaggerated slowness, her movements deliberate and theatrical. "Mr. Thompson," she said, reading the name from her screen, "this ticket seems suspicious to me. First class is expensive. Are you sure this is really your seat behind Victoria, Carlos?" Martinez felt his stomach drop. He had seen the reservation come through the computer. He had processed the upgrade confirmation. He knew the ticket was legitimate because he had handled the transaction himself when Marcus had called to modify his meal preference 2 days earlier. But Victoria was his supervisor, and speaking up could cost him his job. "Yes, it's my seat," Marcus replied, maintaining his composure with tremendous effort. "I booked it 3 weeks ago. I have the confirmation email if you need to see it." "Everyone has emails," Victoria said dismissively. "That doesn't prove anything. People forge documents all the time." She turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. "Folks, we're going to need a few minutes to verify some documentation. We appreciate your patience while we ensure everyone's safety." Robert Hayes, standing 6 people back in line, activated his phone's recording function. As a freelance journalist, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when authority was being abused, and everything about this interaction screamed wrongness. He angled his phone discreetly, making sure to capture both Victoria's face and Marcus's reaction. "This is live from Chicago." "O'Hare," Robert whispered into his phone, beginning an impromptu live stream. "We're watching something incredible happen at Gate B23, and I don't think it's going to end well for anyone." Marcus pulled out his wallet and extracted his driver's license, credit card, and business card. He placed them on the counter in front of Victoria with a deliberate precision. "Here's my identification. Here's the credit card I used to purchase the ticket, and here's my business card if you need to verify my identity or my ability to afford first-class travel." Victoria barely glanced at the documents. "People forge IDs all the time," she said, "and just because you have a business card doesn't mean anything. I can print business cards at any office supply store for $5. The crowd around the gate was growing larger as passengers from other flights paused to watch the confrontation. The energy was uncomfortable, charged with tension and the unspoken recognition that something deeply wrong was happening in plain sight. Jennifer Walsh, the flight attendant who had been preparing for boarding, moved closer to the desk. She had initially planned to support Victoria, as she always did with gate operations, but something about the passenger's calm demeanor and Victoria's increasingly aggressive tone was making her uncomfortable. "Excuse me," Jennifer interjected quietly. "I can verify the reservation in our system if that would help resolve this." Victoria shot her a sharp look. "I'm handling this, Jennifer. Please prepare the aircraft for boarding." But Jennifer remained where she was, watching the interaction with growing concern. The passenger wasn't acting like someone who was trying to scam the system. He wasn't argumentative, wasn't demanding special treatment, wasn't displaying any of the behaviors that typically accompanied fraudulent bookings. He was simply standing there, calmly providing documentation and being humiliated for no apparent reason. Marcus felt his phone vibrate with a text message. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his CFO investors confirmed for 3 p.m., everything riding on this meeting. Safe travels. The irony was crushing. His safe travels were being prevented not by weather or mechanical problems, but by prejudice and ignorance. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying just a hint of steel. "Now, I've provided every piece of identification you've requested. I've been polite and patient. What exactly do you need to see to allow me to board the flight I've legitimately purchased?" Victoria crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair, a triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I need to see proof that you belong in first class. And frankly, looking at you right now, I don't see it." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Even passengers who had been only half listening to the exchange now turned their full attention to the gate. The accusation was no longer subtle or coded. It was direct, ugly, and undeniable. Robert's live stream had attracted over 2,000 viewers, and the comments were exploding with outrage. He adjusted his angle to make sure Victoria's face was clearly visible as he continued narrating the scene. "Folks, we're watching what appears to be racial profiling happening in real time at Chicago O'Hare Airport," Robert said quietly into his phone. "This passenger has provided every piece of documentation requested, and he's still being denied boarding based on what appears to be nothing more than his appearance." Carlos Martinez couldn't stay silent any longer. The weight of his conscience was crushing the fear of unemployment. He stepped forward slightly and cleared his throat. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I processed this passenger's reservation myself. It's legitimate. The credit card cleared the ID matches. Everything is in order." Victoria whirled around to face Carlos, her eyes blazing with fury. "Excuse me. Are you questioning my judgment? Because if you are, we can discuss your employment status right now." Carlos felt the blood drain from his face, but he stood his ground. "I'm just saying the reservation is valid. I can show you the confirmation in the system." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Victoria snapped. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know fraud when I see it." Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement. Here was a young man risking his job to speak the truth while a 15-year veteran was doubling down on prejudice in the face of overwhelming evidence. It was a perfect microcosm of how progress happened. One person at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Michael Bradford, the shift supervisor, arrived at the gate after receiving a call about a situation. He approached Victoria's desk with the weary expression of a man who had spent 20 years putting out fires. "What's the problem here?" Michael asked, surveying the scene with professional detachment. "Suspected fraudulent booking," Victoria replied immediately. "Passenger doesn't match the profile for first-class service, appears to have been drinking. Ticket seems suspicious." Michael looked at Marcus taking in his casual clothes and the coffee stain on his shirt. Without examining any of the documentation Marcus had provided, Michael nodded. "Okay, sir, we're going to need you to step aside while we verify your booking. I've already provided all my documentation," Marcus replied, his patience beginning to fray. "Your gate agent has confirmed the reservation is legitimate." "What exactly are we verifying?" Michael's response was automatic, delivered with the tone of someone who had made similar decisions countless times before. "We have the right to deny boarding to any passenger we deem a security risk or who appears to be under the influence of alcohol." "I'm not under the influence of anything," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "I'm a businessman traveling to an important meeting. I've provided every piece of identification you've requested, and I'm being treated this way because of how I look, nothing else." The words, "because of how I look," created a moment of uncomfortable silence. Everyone in the gate area understood exactly what Marcus was saying, even if no one wanted to acknowledge it directly. Robert's live stream had now attracted over 10,000 viewers, and the hashtag Skyline Racism was beginning to trend on social media. Comments were pouring in faster than he could read them, but the sentiment was universal outrage at what they were witnessing. "The passenger has offered to show documentation," Robert narrated for his viewers. "He's been polite and professional throughout this entire interaction. And he's being denied boarding on what appears to be completely arbitrary grounds." Victoria sensed that the situation was slipping away from her control. The crowd was growing larger, more phones were being pointed in her direction, and the passenger was starting to push back. She needed to regain authority and end this interaction on her terms. "Sir," she announced loudly, You're causing a disturbance. You're being belligerent and confrontational. For the safety and comfort of our other passengers, I'm denying you boarding on this flight." The accusation of being belligerent was the final straw for Marcus. He had maintained his composure for 15 minutes while being systematically humiliated, providing every piece of documentation requested, speaking calmly and respectfully despite being treated like a criminal. And now he was being accused of causing the very disturbance that had been created by prejudice and ignorance. Belligerent Marcus repeated his voice, carrying a quiet intensity that made everyone in the area pay attention. "I've been nothing but polite. I've answered every question you've asked. I've provided every piece of documentation you've requested. The only thing I've done wrong here is exist while black in your first-class boarding line." The statement hit like lightning. Marcus had said out loud what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to acknowledge. The elephant in the room was no longer invisible. It was standing right in front of them, demanding to be seen. Jennifer Walsh felt something snap inside her chest. She had watched this entire interaction unfold, had seen a legitimate passenger be systematically humiliated, and had remained silent because she wanted to support her colleagues. But supporting colleagues didn't mean supporting injustice. Victoria Jennifer said, stepping forward, "I think we need to just process his boarding pass and get him on the plane. He's provided valid documentation. Carlos has confirmed the reservation and we have no legitimate grounds for denial." Victoria's face flushed red with anger. "Jennifer, you're out of line. This passenger is being denied boarding and that decision is final." Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card holder. From it, he extracted a card and placed it on the counter next to his other documentation. "This is who I am," he said quietly. "Dr. Marcus Thompson, founder and CEO of BioNova Therapeutics. I'm flying to Los Angeles to close a $2.8 billion merger that will bring life-saving treatments to patients around the world. That meeting is in 4 hours, and this is the last flight that will get me there on time." Victoria picked up the business card and examined it with theatrical skepticism. "Anyone can print business cards," she repeated. "This proves nothing." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Victoria his screen. "This is my contact list," he said. "I can call my attorney right now, or my CFO, or the executives waiting for me in Los Angeles. Would you like me to have someone confirm my identity? I don't care who you think you can call," Victoria replied. "You're not boarding this flight." The crowd around the gate had grown to over 50 people. Other flights were being delayed as passengers and airline employees stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. The energy was electric, charged with the tension of witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond a missed flight. Robert's live stream had reached 15,000 viewers and was climbing rapidly. Local news stations had started monitoring the feed, recognizing that they were witnessing a story that would dominate the news cycle. Marcus looked around at the crowd of faces watching him. Some showed sympathy, others showed discomfort, and a few showed the cruel curiosity of people watching a car accident. He realized that this moment would define not just his day, but potentially his entire company's future. How he handled himself right now would be judged by thousands of people and could impact the merger that represented years of work. He took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Sterling Aviation Services, this is David. David, this is Marcus Thompson. I need immediate private transportation from Chicago O'Hare to Los Angeles. How quickly can you have a jet ready?" There was a brief pause. "Mr. Thompson, we can have a G650 fueled and ready for departure in 20 minutes. Will this be a one-way trip?" "Yes. I'll be at the private aviation terminal in 15 minutes. Marcus ended the call and looked directly at Victoria. His voice was calm, steady, and carried the quiet authority of someone who had just made a decision that would cost more than most people earned in a year. "Thank you for your service today," he said. "I hope you remember this moment." Victoria laughed a short, ugly sound. "Are you threatening me? Because if you are, I'll have security remove you from the terminal." "I'm not threatening anyone," Marcus replied. I'm simply saying that actions have consequences, and yours are about to catch up with you." He gathered his documentation from the counter, placed it back in his briefcase, and turned to address the crowd that had gathered around the gate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the space, "you've just witnessed something that happens far too often in America. A person of color being denied service dignity and basic respect for no reason other than the prejudices of those in positions of power. I hope you'll remember what you saw here today." As Marcus walked away from the gate, Robert continued his live stream commentary. The passenger is walking away, he reported to his viewers. He's made some kind of phone call for alternative transportation. This story is far from over. Victoria watched Marcus leave with a satisfied smirk. She had maintained order, protected her standards, and removed what she perceived as a problem passenger. In her mind, she had done her job exactly as she was trained to do it. What she didn't know was that her 15-year career had just ended. Her name was about to become synonymous with racial prejudice, and the man walking away from her gate was about to prove that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that operates far beyond airport security and corporate policies. Flight 447 would board 15 minutes late due to the security incident. Victoria would make an announcement blaming the delay on an unruly passenger who had to be denied boarding for everyone's safety. But by the time that flight took off from Chicago, Marcus would already be in the air racing toward Los Angeles in a private jet that cost more per hour to operate than Victoria earned in a month. The real reckoning was just beginning. As Marcus walked away from Gate B-23, the energy in the departure area shifted like a storm front moving through. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation between one passenger and one gate agent was about to become something much larger, much more public, and much more devastating for everyone involved. Victoria stood behind her podium with the satisfied expression of someone who had just won a battle. She smoothed her hair, adjusted her jacket, and prepared to continue the boarding process, as if nothing significant had happened. In her mind, she had simply done her job, protecting the standards and safety of Skyline Airways by removing a problematic passenger. But the crowd around the gate hadn't dispersed. If anything, it had grown larger. Passengers from other flights had stopped to watch the confrontation, drawn by the electric tension and the growing certainty that they were witnessing something historically significant. The normal bustle of airport activity had slowed to focus on Gate B-23, where 50-plus people stood staring at a gate agent who seemed oblivious to the magnitude of what had just occurred. Robert Hayes continued his live stream, his viewer count climbing toward 20,000 as word spread across social media platforms. His phone battery was dropping rapidly from the constant video transmission, but he couldn't stop recording. He sensed that this story was far from over. "Folks, the passenger has left the gate area," Robert reported to his audience, "but something tells me this is just the beginning. The energy here is unlike anything I've experienced in years of travel. Everyone seems to understand that we just witnessed something that's going to have major consequences." The comments on Robert's stream were multiplying faster than he could read them. Skyline racism was trending nationally, with thousands of users sharing the video and adding their own commentary. Several major news outlets had started monitoring the stream, recognizing that they were watching a story that would dominate headlines within hours. Carlos Martinez stood behind the gate desk, feeling sick to his stomach. He had spoken up, had tried to do the right thing, but it hadn't been enough to prevent the injustice he had just witnessed. The legitimate passenger had been humiliated and denied boarding, and Carlos knew that his mild intervention had probably cost him his job without accomplishing anything meaningful. But Carlos had documented everything on his personal phone. Every interaction, every piece of evidence that proved Marcus's reservation was legitimate, every moment of Victoria's increasingly unreasonable behavior. He had recorded it all, knowing that someone would need to bear witness to what had really happened. Jennifer Walsh felt a knot of shame growing in her chest. She had watched a paying passenger be systematically humiliated, had seen clear evidence of discriminatory treatment, and had done almost nothing to stop it. Her mild objections had been easily overruled, and she hadn't pushed harder because she was afraid of confronting her colleagues. But something about Marcus's dignified response to the abuse had shaken her. The way he had maintained his composure while being accused of fraud, the calm professionalism he had displayed while being treated like a criminal, the quiet authority in his voice when he had finally named what was happening. It had all forced Jennifer to confront uncomfortable truths about the industry she worked in and her own complicity in perpetuating injustice. Michael Bradford was beginning to realize that he had made a serious error in judgment. As the shift supervisor, he had automatically supported Victoria's assessment without investigating the situation thoroughly. He had seen a casually dressed black man being questioned by an experienced gate agent, and he had made assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence. Now, watching the reaction of the crowd and sensing the growing attention from social media, Michael understood that this incident was going to attract scrutiny from corporate headquarters. And when that scrutiny arrived, his automatic support for Victoria's decision would be examined and found lacking. Victoria, meanwhile, was preparing to make an announcement that would seal her fate and ensure that this story reached an even wider audience. She activated the gate announcement system, and her voice echoed through the departure area with crisp authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay in boarding Flight 447 to Los Angeles. We experienced a security situation with an unruly passenger who had to be denied boarding for everyone's safety. We appreciate your patience as we ensure the security and comfort of all our valued customers." The announcement was the final straw for many of the passengers who had witnessed the actual confrontation. They had seen a calm professional man being systematically humiliated, and now they were hearing him described as an unruly security threat. The disconnect between reality and Victoria's narrative was so glaring that it sparked immediate outrage. "That's not what happened," called out Margaret Chen, a passenger who had been waiting in the regular boarding line. "That man was completely polite. You treated him terribly." Her voice carried across the gate area, and other passengers began nodding and murmuring their agreement. The crowd that had witnessed the confrontation was turning against Victoria, and their anger was becoming audible. "He showed you his ID," added James Rodriguez, another passenger. "He answered every question you asked. You denied him boarding because of how he looked." Victoria's face flushed red as she realized that her narrative was being challenged by witnesses to the actual events. She had expected the crowd to support her authority and move on to their flights, but instead they were actively contradicting her version of events. "I'm going to need everyone to return to their seats and prepare for boarding," Victoria announced through the PA system, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "Anyone who continues to cause disruptions will be denied boarding as well." The threat only made things worse. Passengers who had been murmuring their disagreement now began speaking more loudly, emboldened by Victoria's obvious discomfort and her attempt to silence their objections. Robert adjusted his phone to capture Victoria's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. "You can see the gate agent trying to suppress passenger objections to what they witnessed," he narrated for his viewers. "She's threatening to deny boarding to anyone who speaks up about the discriminatory treatment they just saw." The live stream audience was approaching 30,000 viewers, and clips from Robert's video were being shared across Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Skyline racism was now the #1 trending hashtag in the United States, and major news outlets were scrambling to send reporters to O'Hare. In the Skyline Airways corporate offices in Atlanta, executives were beginning to receive alerts about a developing situation in Chicago. Social media monitoring systems had flagged the massive spike in negative mentions, and crisis management teams were being activated to assess the scope of the problem. Victoria, unaware that her actions were being scrutinized by millions of people online, decided to double down on her authority. She picked up the phone and called airport security. "This is Victoria Ashworth at Gate B23, she said, her voice carrying clearly to the nearby passengers. "I need security to disperse a crowd of agitated passengers who are disrupting our boarding process." The call to security was the moment when many passengers realized that Victoria was completely disconnected from reality. She wasn't acknowledging what they had witnessed, wasn't taking responsibility for her treatment of Marcus, and now she was trying to have them removed for expressing their objections to discriminatory behavior. Several passengers immediately pulled out their phones and began recording their own videos, wanting to document their experiences before they could be silenced or removed from the area. The gate area became a sea of raised phones, all capturing different angles of Victoria's meltdown, from authority figure to desperate damage control. Carlos Martinez made a decision that would define his character for the rest of his life. He stepped forward to Victoria's desk and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Victoria, I can't stay quiet about this anymore," he said, his voice trembling but determined. That passenger's reservation was completely legitimate. I processed it myself. His ID matched his credit card, cleared, everything was in order. He was denied boarding because of racial bias, and I can't pretend otherwise. Victoria stared at Carlos in shock. Her young colleague, the employee she had been mentoring, had just publicly contradicted her in front of dozens of witnesses and thousands of online viewers. It was the ultimate betrayal in her mind, and her response was swift and vicious. "Carlos, you're fired," she snapped. "Clear out your desk and turn in your badge. You're done here." But Carlos stood his ground. "Fine," he said. "I'd rather lose my job than lose my integrity. Everyone here saw what really happened, and I won't lie about it to protect anyone." The crowd around the gate erupted in applause for Carlos's courage. Here was a young man risking his livelihood to speak the truth, standing up to authority despite the personal cost. His moral courage, in the face of retaliation, created a powerful moment that resonated far beyond the airport terminal. Jennifer Walsh felt Carlos's example burning in her chest like inspiration. If a young man with 6 months of experience could risk his job to do the right thing, what excuse did she have with 12 years of experience and more job security? Victoria Jennifer said, stepping forward. "Carlos is right. I watched the entire interaction, and that passenger was treated unfairly. He provided every piece of documentation requested, remained calm and professional throughout, and was denied boarding for reasons that had nothing to do with security or safety." Victoria felt her world spinning out of control. First, the passengers had turned against her, then Carlos had betrayed her, and now Jennifer was publicly contradicting her authority. The boarding process had completely stopped. Security was on the way, and 30,000 people were watching her professional destruction unfold in real time. "All of you are out of line," Victoria declared, her voice rising to near hysteria. "I am the senior gate supervisor here, and I make the decisions about who boards these flights. That passenger was suspicious, his story didn't add up, and I protected the safety and security of this aircraft by denying him boarding." Margaret Chen, the passenger who had first spoken up, couldn't contain herself any longer. "His story was completely consistent," she called out. "You asked him questions, he answered them. You asked for ID, he provided it. The only thing suspicious here is your behavior." Other passengers joined in, their voices growing louder and more confident. "He was more professional than you were. You treated him like a criminal for no reason. This is exactly what racial profiling looks like. You should be ashamed of yourself." The crowd's anger was building to a crescendo when airport security arrived. 3 officers approached the gate area, expecting to find disruptive passengers who needed to be dispersed or removed. Instead, they found dozens of travelers united in their condemnation of what they perceived as discriminatory treatment by an airline employee. Officer Patricia Williams, an African-American security supervisor with 15 years of airport experience, immediately recognized the complexity of the situation. She had seen enough discrimination in her career to spot it quickly, and the passengers' unified testimony about what they had witnessed was compelling evidence that something had gone seriously wrong. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Williams asked, addressing Victoria directly. Victoria launched into her prepared narrative. "I denied boarding to a suspicious passenger who appeared to be under the influence of alcohol, and whose ticket seemed fraudulent. Now, these passengers are being disruptive and refusing to board the aircraft." Officer Williams looked around at the crowd of passengers, most of whom were well-dressed business travelers, and families who hardly seemed like security threats. She then looked at Carlos, who was still standing behind the gate desk despite being fired. "What's your perspective on what happened?" she asked Carlos. Carlos took a deep breath and told the truth. "The passenger's reservation was completely legitimate. I processed it myself. He provided valid identification, answered all questions politely, and was denied boarding for what appeared to be discriminatory reasons. When passengers objected to his treatment, Miss Ashworth threatened to deny them boarding as well." Officer Williams nodded and turned to Jennifer. "You work for the airline. What did you observe?" Jennifer felt every eye in the area focused on her. This was her moment to choose between career advancement and moral courage, between protecting her colleague and protecting the truth. "The passenger was treated unfairly," Jennifer said clearly. "He provided all requested documentation, remained professional throughout the interaction, and was denied boarding for reasons that appeared to be based on his race rather than any legitimate security concern." Victoria watched in horror as her own colleagues testified against her in front of airport security, dozens of passengers, and thousands of online viewers. Her 15-year career was dissolving in real time, and she seemed powerless to stop it. Officer Williams had heard enough. "Ma'am," she said to Victoria, "I'm going to need you to step away from the gate while we sort this out. There will be an investigation into this incident, and your supervisor will need to be notified." Victoria's last vestige of control disappeared. She was being removed from her own gate in front of everyone by airport security. The humiliation was complete and devastating. As security escorted Victoria away from gate B-23, the crowd of passengers finally began to disperse. But the damage was done, the story was out, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. Robert ended his live stream after 2 hours and 47 minutes of continuous coverage. His final viewer count was over 75,000 people, and clips from his video would be shared millions of times over the next 24 hours. Flight 447 finally boarded nearly an hour behind schedule due to the incident. Many passengers chose to deplane rather than fly with an airline that had just demonstrated such clear discriminatory practices. But Marcus Thompson was already in the air racing toward Los Angeles in a private jet that would arrive hours before the commercial flight he had been denied boarding on. And in a few hours, the airline industry would discover exactly who they had chosen to humiliate at Gate B-23. While chaos continued to unfold at Gate B-23 in Chicago, Marcus Thompson sat in the leather-appointed cabin of a Gulfstream G 650, 39,000 feet above the American Midwest, reviewing the merger documents that would reshape the biotechnology industry. The transformation from public humiliation to private luxury had taken exactly 18 minutes. From the moment Marcus had walked away from Victoria's gate, everything had moved with the precision of a machine designed to solve problems that money could solve. A black Audi Q7 had picked him up at the terminal curb. A 5-minute drive to the private aviation section of O'Hare. A brief security screening in an elegant lounge. And then he was climbing the steps of a $70 million aircraft that existed specifically to ensure that people like him never had to depend on people like Victoria ever again. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had deliberately dressed down and flown commercial specifically to avoid the assumptions and attention that came with obvious wealth. But when prejudice had denied him basic service, wealth had provided an alternative that was far superior to anything Skyline Airways could have offered. The G650 was a flying office equipped with high-speed internet conference capabilities and every amenity necessary to conduct business at altitude. While Victoria was being escorted away from her gate by security, Marcus was reviewing financial projections and conducting video conferences with his team in California. Dr. Sarah Chen, his chief scientific officer, appeared on the cabin's video screen from BioNova's headquarters in Palo Alto. "Marcus, we saw the social media coverage of what happened at the airport," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Are you all right?" Marcus looked up from his documents, considering how to answer. Was he all right? Physically, yes. Emotionally, he was processing the particular kind of trauma that came from being publicly humiliated for the crime of existing, while black, in a space where he wasn't expected. But professionally, he was exactly where he needed to be. "I'm fine, Sarah," he replied. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm going to arrive in Los Angeles 3 hours before the commercial flight would have gotten me there. Sometimes the universe forces you into better circumstances, even when it doesn't feel like it at the time." Sarah smiled on the screen. "That's certainly one way to look at it. The MedCorps team is confirmed for 3 o'clock. They're excited about the presentation." Marcus nodded. The MedCorps merger was the culmination of 7 years of research and development. BioNova Therapeutics had developed a revolutionary gene therapy platform that could treat previously incurable genetic diseases. But developing treatments and distributing them to patients were entirely different challenges. MedCorps Industries had the manufacturing capabilities, regulatory expertise, and global distribution network that could turn BioNova's laboratory breakthroughs into treatments that could save lives around the world. The $2.8 billion merger wasn't just about money, though the financial security it would provide was significant. It was about ensuring that the treatments his team had developed would reach the patients who needed them. Every day of delay meant someone somewhere was suffering from a condition that BioNova could potentially cure. As the G650 cruised towards California, Marcus allowed himself to think about the broader implications of what had happened at O'Hare. Victoria Ashworth had acted on assumptions and prejudices that were older than the airline industry itself. She had looked at a successful black man and seen only stereotypes. But her discrimination had consequences that extended far beyond a missed flight. The social media coverage was unprecedented. Skyline racism was trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing their own stories of discrimination in travel, employment, and daily life. The incident had sparked a conversation about bias that reached far beyond aviation. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through some of the social media posts. The support was overwhelming. People from every background were expressing outrage at his treatment and admiration for his dignified response. But more importantly, they were sharing their own experiences and discussing how discrimination could be challenged and eliminated. One post particularly caught his attention. It was from Carlos Martinez, the young gate agent who had been fired for telling the truth. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. But staying silent costs you your soul. No regrets. Skyline racism." Marcus immediately direct messaged Carlos. "Your courage today inspired millions of people. When this is over, call me." BioNova could use someone with your integrity. Meanwhile, Flight 447 was experiencing turbulence that had nothing to do with weather. The late departure from Chicago had created a cascade of problems. The flight crew was dealing with agitated passengers who were demanding explanations for the delay. Several travelers had asked to be rebooked on different airlines. The flight attendants were fielding questions about the incident at the gate that no one was prepared to answer. Robert Hayes, the freelance journalist who had live-streamed the entire confrontation, was now conducting informal interviews with other passengers. His documentation of the event had turned him into an accidental activist, and other travelers were seeking him out to share their thoughts about what they had witnessed. "I've been flying for business for 20 years, said Patricia Morrison, a white marketing executive from Detroit. "I've seen passengers treated poorly before, but nothing like this." That man was completely professional, provided every piece of identification they asked for, and was denied boarding for absolutely no reason. It was racism, pure and simple. James Rodriguez, a Latino software engineer, was more blunt in his assessment. "What I saw today was a power trip wrapped in prejudice. That gate agent decided that black man didn't belong in first class, and she was going to make sure he knew it. The fact that he had every right to be there didn't matter to her." The conversations happening on Flight 447 were being replicated on social media platforms around the world. The incident had struck a nerve because it was both extraordinary and ordinary. Extraordinary in how clearly it demonstrated institutional racism, but ordinary in how familiar the experience was to millions of people who had faced similar discrimination. In Los Angeles, the Medcore Industries executives were monitoring the social media coverage with growing interest. They had been prepared to meet with Dr. Marcus Thompson, the respected CEO of BioNova Therapeutics. They hadn't expected him to arrive as the center of a national conversation about civil rights and corporate responsibility. Dr. James Patterson, Medcore's chairman and CEO, was reviewing the coverage on his assistant's tablet. "This is remarkable," he said. "Look at how he handled himself. Complete professionalism under pressure. The kind of character and leadership we want associated with our company." CFO Linda Walsh disagreed. "This could be a public relations nightmare. Do we really want to be associated with this level of controversy?" Dr. Patterson looked at her with surprise. "Linda, we're about to partner with a company that develops life-saving treatments. Their CEO was discriminated against while traveling to meet with us, and his response was dignified and inspiring. I can't think of better publicity for our merger." As the G650 began its descent toward Los Angeles, Marcus felt a sense of anticipation that went beyond the business meeting ahead. The events at O'Hare had been traumatic and infuriating, but they had also created an opportunity to address issues that were much larger than airline policies. BioNova Therapeutics was more than just a biotechnology company. It was an organization built on the principle that scientific innovation should serve humanity, regardless of background, income, or social status. The discrimination Marcus had experienced that morning was a reminder of why that mission mattered. The G650 touched down at LAX exactly 2 hours and 37 minutes after takeoff from Chicago. Marcus had traveled 1,500 miles in luxury and comfort while conducting business and preparing for the most important meeting of his professional life. The contrast with the humiliation he had experienced at O'Hare was stark and deliberate. As Marcus collected his briefcase and prepared to disembark, he received a text message from his assistant. Medcore meeting moved up to 2 p.m. at their request. They want to discuss both the merger and the morning's events. Marcus smiled. The airline industry's attempt to keep him in his place had instead elevated him to a platform where his voice could reach millions of people. Victoria Ashworth's prejudice had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Flight 447 was still 47 minutes from landing at LAX. When it finally arrived, Victoria's passengers would discover that the man their gate agent had humiliated was already in the boardrooms of Century City closing deals that would make international headlines. The private jet that had seemed like an extravagance would prove to be the best investment Marcus had ever made. Not because of the luxury, but because of the statement it made about the consequences of treating people with dignity versus treating them with prejudice. As Marcus stepped off the Gulfstream onto the tarmac at LAX, he pulled out his phone and posted a single message on social media. "Arrived in Los Angeles 3 hours early thanks to alternative arrangements. Sometimes obstacles become opportunities. Looking forward to productive meetings ahead." Dignity in travel, the post would be shared over 2 million times in the next 24 hours. But Marcus wasn't thinking about social media metrics as he climbed into another black SUV for the drive to Century City. He was thinking about the millions of patients who would benefit from the merger he was about to complete, and the young gate agent named Carlos who had risked his job to stand up for truth. Justice Marcus had learned came in many forms. Sometimes it was swift and public. Sometimes it was private and personal. And sometimes it was served at 39,000 feet in a private jet that arrived exactly when it was needed. At exactly 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time, as Flight 447 was making its final approach to Los Angeles International Airport, Dr. Marcus Thompson was shaking hands with Dr. James Patterson in the executive boardroom of Medcore Industries, having just signed the documents that would create the largest biotechnology merger in American history. The $2.8 billion deal had been completed in record time, partly because both companies had been preparing for months, but mostly because the Medcore executives had been so impressed by Marcus's handling of the morning's crisis that they had expedited every aspect of the process. Dr. Patterson said as photographers captured the historic moment your grace under pressure this morning demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we want in our merged organization. BioNova's scientific innovations, combined with your personal character, make this partnership even more valuable than we had anticipated." Marcus smiled and nodded, but his attention was divided between the historic merger and his phone, which had been buzzing continuously with notifications. The social media storm that had begun at Gate B-23 in Chicago had grown into a hurricane that was reshaping conversations about discrimination across every platform. Skyline racism wasn't just trending. It was dominating global social media with over 12 million posts and climbing. Major news networks had picked up the story, civil rights organizations were issuing statements, and corporate executives across America were examining their own policies to avoid similar public relations disasters. But the real reckoning was just beginning for the individuals who had made the choices that created this moment. Victoria Ashworth sat in the security office at O'Hare International Airport, watching her 15-year career dissolve on a laptop screen. The video of her confrontation with Marcus had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. Her name was trending on Twitter, her photograph was appearing on news websites, and the comment sections were filled with thousands of people expressing their outrage at her behavior. The security supervisor across from her was reviewing the statements that had been gathered from passengers, airline employees, and airport personnel. Every witness account contradicted Victoria's version of events. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Miss Ashworth, Officer Williams said, closing the folder based on the witness statements and video evidence, "It's clear that you denied boarding to a legitimate passenger based on discriminatory criteria. Skyline Airways has been notified and they're sending a representative from corporate to address this situation." Victoria stared at the laptop screen, watching herself being replayed over and over again in the worst moments of her professional life. "This is taken out of context," she said weakly. "You don't understand the pressures of airline security. We have to make quick decisions to protect passengers." "Ma'am?" Officer Williams replied, "I've been in airport security for 15 years. I understand the pressures. But what we saw today wasn't security. It was prejudice, and there's a difference." At Gate B-23, Carlos Martinez was cleaning out his desk under the watchful eye of Michael Bradford, who had arrived to manage the crisis. Carlos had been officially terminated, but he felt lighter than he had in months. The weight of compromising his values for job security was gone, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing when it mattered most. Carlos Michael said, "I want you to know that this wasn't personal. You're a good worker. But challenging your supervisor in front of passengers isn't acceptable protocol." Carlos looked up from packing his belongings. "With respect, Mr. Bradford standing by while someone is discriminated against isn't acceptable either. I'd rather find a new job than lose my integrity." Michael shifted uncomfortably. In the 3 hours since the incident, Skyline Airways corporate had been bombarded with negative publicity, customer complaints, and demands for accountability. The stock price had dropped 8%, and crisis management teams were working around the clock to control the damage. "Look," Michael said quietly, "between you and me, you might not be unemployed for long. Corporate is going to want to distance themselves from this situation, and employees who stood up for the passenger are going to look good in the aftermath." Carlos nodded but didn't respond. He had learned something important about himself that day. His conscience was worth more than his paycheck. Whatever came next, he would face it with dignity. Jennifer Walsh was conducting an interview with Skyline Airways head of human resources Maria Rodriguez, who had flown in from Atlanta to handle the crisis. The conversation was being recorded and would become part of the official investigation. "Jennifer, your statement indicates that you witnessed the entire interaction between Miss Ashworth and the passenger. In your professional opinion, was the denial of boarding justified?" Maria asked. Jennifer had spent the afternoon thinking about this question. For 12 years, she had prioritized company loyalty and colleague solidarity over everything else. But watching Marcus Thompson maintain his dignity while being systematically humiliated had forced her to examine her own complicity in perpetuating injustice. "No," Jennifer said clearly. The passenger provided all requested documentation, answered every question politely, and posed no security threat. He was denied boarding because Miss Ashworth didn't believe he belonged in first class. It was discrimination, pure and simple. Maria nodded and made notes. Skyline Airways was facing the biggest public relations crisis in its history, and the company's response in the next 48 hours would determine whether they survived or became another cautionary tale about the cost of institutional prejudice. Meanwhile, Flight 447 had landed at LAX, and the passengers were discovering that the man they had seen humiliated in Chicago was now making international headlines. Robert Hayes was still documenting the story, interviewing passengers as they disembarked and learned about the day's developments. "When we saw what happened at the gate," said Margaret Chen, the passenger who had first spoken up for Marcus, "we knew it was wrong. But we had no idea we were witnessing something that would become this significant. I'm just glad someone had the courage to record it." James Rodriguez was more direct. That gate agent picked on the wrong person. She thought she could humiliate someone with impunity, but she chose to mess with a man who had the resources and platform to expose her prejudice to the world. Sometimes, justice is served in the most unexpected ways. The passengers' reactions were being broadcast live on social media, adding another layer to the story that was already dominating news cycles. The incident had evolved from a single act of discrimination into a global conversation about bias power and accountability. At the Skyline Airways corporate headquarters in Atlanta, CEO David Morrison was conducting an emergency meeting with his executive team. The company's stock price was in free fall, customer service lines were overwhelmed with complaints, and every major news outlet was requesting interviews about the incident. "How did this happen?" Morrison demanded. "How does one gate agent create a crisis that threatens our entire company?" Chief Operating Officer Lisa Chang pulled up the social media analytics on the conference room screen. The video has been viewed over 80 million times in the past 6 hours. Skyline racism is the top trending topic globally. We're looking at the fastest spreading corporate crisis in aviation history. Morrison reviewed the passenger manifest that his assistants had prepared. "Do we know who this Dr. Thompson actually is? What kind of resources are we dealing with?" Chief Legal Officer Richard Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir Dr. Marcus Thompson is the founder and CEO of BioNova Therapeutics. His company just completed a $2.8 billion merger with MedCore Industries approximately 45 minutes ago. The announcement is making headlines in the financial press." The room fell silent. Morrison stared at the passenger manifest, understanding for the first time the magnitude of what his employee had done. Skyline Airways had not just discriminated against a random passenger. They had publicly humiliated one of the most successful biotechnology entrepreneurs in America on the day he was closing the biggest merger in industry history. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "We denied boarding to a billionaire. It gets worse." Hayes continued. "Dr. Thompson arrived at his meeting 3 hours early via private jet. While our flight was delayed and dealing with negative publicity, he was conducting interviews with major news outlets about discrimination in the travel industry. He's not just a victim of this incident. He's becoming the face of a movement." Morrison felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just a customer service failure or even a discrimination incident. This was a complete public relations catastrophe that threatened the fundamental reputation and viability of his company. In Century City, Marcus was wrapping up a series of interviews with CNN, NBC, and the Associated Press. The merger announcement had been overshadowed by the discrimination story, but the combination of business success and social justice advocacy had created a media narrative that was resonating with audiences worldwide. Dr. Thompson asked Sarah Williams from CNN, "How do you respond to people who say this incident was an isolated case of one employee's poor judgment rather than a reflection of broader issues in the airline industry?" Marcus considered his response carefully. Sarah: "I think today's events demonstrate that discrimination is often most visible when it happens to people who have the resources and platform to expose it. But for every incident that gets recorded and shared on social media, there are hundreds that happen to people who don't have the ability to fight back. This isn't about me personally. It's about creating accountability for the way all passengers are treated. The interview was being broadcast live, and Marcus's measured, thoughtful response was being praised across social media as an example of how to use privilege and platform responsibly. The contrast between his dignity and Victoria's prejudice was creating a powerful narrative about character under pressure. At O'Hare Airport, Victoria was escorted to her car by security after being officially terminated by Skyline Airways. The letter of termination had been delivered by a corporate representative who had flown in specifically to handle her dismissal. Her severance package was minimal. Her benefits were terminated immediately, and her reputation in the airline industry was destroyed. As Victoria drove home through Chicago traffic, her phone buzzed continuously with notifications. Friends and family members were calling to ask if the woman in the viral video was really her. Local news stations were requesting interviews, and the comment sections of every platform were filled with people expressing their outrage at her behavior. She pulled over at a gas station and finally looked at her phone. The first thing she saw was a notification that she had been tagged in a post by Dr. Marcus Thompson. "Today, I was discriminated against by an airline employee who judged me based on my appearance rather than my character." While this experience was personally painful, I hope it sparks important conversations about dignity, respect, and the unconscious biases that affect how we treat each other. I believe people can change and grow from their mistakes. Dignity in Travel Victoria stared at the post in shock. After everything she had put him through, Marcus Thompson was responding with grace and even suggesting the possibility of redemption. The contrast between his character and her behavior was overwhelming, and for the first time that day, Victoria began to truly understand the magnitude of what she had done. The post had been shared over 3 million times with comments praising Marcus's maturity and calling for Victoria to use this opportunity to examine her own biases. But Victoria wasn't thinking about social media engagement or public relations. She was thinking about the fact that she had humiliated an innocent man based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. As evening fell over Chicago and Los Angeles, the story was still developing across multiple platforms and time zones. Flight 447 passengers were sharing their perspectives with news outlets. Carlos Martinez was being contacted by potential employers who had seen his courageous stand, and Jennifer Walsh was cooperating with Skyline Airways' internal investigation. But the most significant development was happening in the quiet moments between public statements and media interviews. Marcus Thompson was using his platform to advocate for changes that would go far beyond airline policies. He was announcing the creation of a foundation focused on dignity and travel funding legal support for passengers who experience discrimination and partnering with civil rights organizations to address bias in service industries. The incident that had begun with one woman's prejudice was evolving into a movement for change that would affect policies and practices across multiple industries. Victoria Ashworth had intended to humiliate a man she thought didn't belong in first class. Instead, she had elevated him to a platform where his voice could reach millions of people and his influence could create lasting change. The irony was complete, the consequences were spreading, and the real story was just beginning. 3 weeks after the incident at O'Hare International Airport, Victoria Ashworth sat in the sterile waiting room of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, holding her mother's trembling hand and fighting back tears. The woman, who had once commanded Gate B-23 with such authority, now looked small and vulnerable in the uncomfortable plastic chair dressed in her best outfit for what felt like a funeral. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez had just delivered news that shattered Victoria's world more completely than any viral video ever could. Her 72-year-old mother, Helen Ashworth, had been diagnosed with Huntington's disease, a rare neurodegenerative disorder that would progressively rob her of her movement, cognition, and eventually her life. The progression varies from patient to patient. Dr. Martinez explained gently, but typically we see significant decline over a period of 5 to 10 years. There is currently no cure, and treatment options are limited to managing symptoms. Helen squeezed her daughter's hand weakly. Since Victoria's father had died 5 years earlier, they had become each other's primary support. Helen had been the one person who had stood by Victoria during the nightmare of unemployment, public humiliation, and social media harassment that had followed the airport incident. "There has to be something," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "Some treatment, some trial, some experimental option. I'll pay anything, do anything." Dr. Martinez nodded sympathetically. "There is one possibility, though it's quite expensive and still considered experimental. A company called BioNova Therapeutics has developed a gene therapy treatment called HT441. The preliminary results have been remarkable. It appears to halt progression and even reverse some symptoms in early-stage patients." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The name hit her like a physical blow. BioNova Therapeutics. Dr. Marcus Thompson's company. The man she had humiliated and discriminated against was the only person on Earth who might be able to save her mother's life. The cosmic cruelty of the situation was so profound that Victoria almost laughed. Of course, of all the companies in all the world developing treatments for rare diseases, it had to be his. The universe seemed determined to force her to confront the consequences of her prejudice in the most personal way possible. "How much does the treatment cost?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would be devastating. "The therapy itself costs approximately $1.2 million, Dr. Martinez replied. "Most insurance companies consider it experimental and won't cover it. However, BioNova has a patient assistance foundation that provides grants for eligible patients who can't afford the treatment." Victoria stared at the medical pamphlet in her hands, featuring a photograph of Dr. Marcus Thompson and information about the Sterling Foundation, named, she realized with growing horror, after the private jet company he had used to circumvent her discrimination. The Foundation's mission statement was printed in elegant typeface, ensuring that financial barriers never prevent patients from accessing life-saving innovations. That night, Victoria sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, staring at the Foundation's grant application. The irony was crushing. The same man she had tried to exclude from first class was now her mother's only hope for survival. The prejudice that had cost Victoria her career might now cost her mother her life. But Helen deserved a chance regardless of Victoria's past mistakes. With shaking fingers, Victoria began filling out the application, providing detailed medical records, financial information, and a personal statement explaining why her mother qualified for assistance. 2 weeks later, Victoria received a phone call that made her hands shake as she answered. "Miss Ashworth, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from BioNova Therapeutics. Your mother's grant application has been approved for immediate processing. We'd like to schedule a consultation to discuss the treatment protocol." Victoria could barely speak. "Approved. Are you sure? Did Dr. Thompson review the application personally?" There was a pause on the line. "Miss Ashworth, all applications are reviewed based solely on medical need and financial circumstances. Patient identity is irrelevant to our approval process. Your mother qualifies for the treatment, and we're committed to helping her." Victoria understood the message. Marcus Thompson either didn't know about her application, or he had deliberately chosen not to let their history affect his decision. Either way, her mother would receive the treatment that could save her life. The appointment was scheduled for the following Wednesday at BioNova's clinical facility in Chicago. Victoria drove her mother to the appointment with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing she might come face to face with the man whose life she had tried to make miserable. The BioNova facility was modern and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows and an atmosphere of cutting-edge medical innovation. As Victoria helped her mother through the registration process, she noticed the photos on the walls, images of patients who had been successfully treated, scientific breakthroughs being celebrated, and at the center of it all, portraits of the research team led by Dr. Marcus Thompson. Mrs. Ashworth. A nurse called from the doorway. "Dr. Thompson will see you now." Victoria felt her stomach drop. She had hoped to avoid this confrontation, to receive the treatment anonymously and somehow maintain distance from the man she had wronged. But now she was being led down a hallway toward an office where she would have to face the consequences of her prejudice directly. The door opened to reveal a spacious office with medical journals lining the shelves and a large window overlooking the Chicago skyline. Dr. Marcus Thompson stood behind his desk reviewing a medical chart. He looked up as they entered, and Victoria saw the exact moment when recognition flickered across his face. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Victoria felt exposed and vulnerable under Marcus's calm gaze, remembering the last time they had faced each other across a professional divide. But this time, the power dynamic was completely reversed. Now, she was the one seeking help, and he was the one in a position to grant or deny it. "Mrs. Ashworth," Marcus said, addressing Helen directly, "please have a seat. I've reviewed your medical records, and I believe you're an excellent candidate for our HT 441 treatment." Helen sat down slowly, unaware of the history between her daughter and the doctor who might save her life. "Dr. Thompson, I can't tell you how grateful we are. Victoria has been so worried researching everything, trying to find options." Marcus glanced at Victoria, who remained standing near the door, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sure she has," he said quietly. "Love makes us do extraordinary things to protect the people who matter to us." The appointment proceeded with clinical professionalism. Marcus explained the treatment protocol, the expected outcomes, the potential side effects, and the follow-up care that would be required. Throughout the conversation, he addressed Helen with warmth and respect, while treating Victoria with polite neutrality. As the appointment concluded, and Helen was escorted to the lab for preliminary testing, Marcus asked Victoria to remain behind. She stood awkwardly in front of his desk, finally understanding what it felt like to be judged by someone with the power to determine her fate. Victoria Marcus said, using her first name for the first time, "I want you to know that your mother will receive the best care we can provide. This treatment has helped hundreds of patients, and I believe it will help her too." Victoria struggled to find words. "Dr. Thompson, I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you. I was wrong completely and inexcusably wrong. I judged you based on prejudice and ignorance, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." Marcus nodded slowly. "I appreciate your apology. What happened at the airport was painful and humiliating, but it also created an opportunity to address issues that are much larger than one incident. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to important conversations and positive changes." "Why are you helping us?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You would have every right to deny my mother treatment, to let me suffer the consequences of my actions." Marcus looked out the window at the city skyline for a moment before responding. "Because healing isn't just about medicine, Victoria. It's about choosing compassion over revenge, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. Your mother needs this treatment, and I became a doctor to help people, not to settle personal scores." Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she finally understood the true measure of the man she had tried to humiliate. Marcus Thompson possessed a grace and character that she had been incapable of recognizing, and his response to her mother's crisis demonstrated the kind of person he truly was. 6 months later, Helen Ashworth was among the first patients to show complete halting of Huntington's disease progression under the HT 441 treatment. The therapy that Victoria had initially seen as cosmic punishment had become their family's salvation. Victoria had used the experience to examine her own biases and prejudices, volunteering with civil rights organizations, and speaking publicly about the dangers of discrimination. She had found new employment with a nonprofit organization that focused on dignity in healthcare, using her experience to train service providers about unconscious bias. The letter she wrote to Marcus after her mother's successful treatment was simple and heartfelt. "Dr. Thompson, your grace in our moment of need taught me more about character than any lesson I had ever learned. Thank you for choosing to heal rather than harm, to show mercy rather than seek justice. My mother is alive and improving because you chose compassion over revenge. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the kindness you showed our family." Marcus's response was equally simple. "Victoria, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them and how we treat others going forward. I'm glad your mother is well. Keep doing the important work you're doing now. The incident that had begun with prejudice had ended with healing. Not just medical healing, but the deeper healing that comes from confronting our worst impulses and choosing to become better people. Victoria had learned that dignity wasn't about appearance or status, but about how we treat others when we have the power to help or harm. And Marcus had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger or revenge, but the quiet demonstration of the character that prejudice tried to deny. 6 months after the incident at Gate B-23, the aviation industry looked fundamentally different. The Skyline racism incident had become a watershed moment that forced airlines across America to confront their own policies, training programs, and corporate cultures. Skyline Airways had implemented comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing employees, created a passenger advocacy position at the executive level, and established a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. The changes came too late to save the company's reputation entirely. They had lost 37% of their market value and were eventually acquired by a competitor. But they had created a template for reform that other airlines rushed to adopt. Carlos Martinez was now the Director of Customer Advocacy for United Airlines, having been recruited specifically because of his courage in standing up to discrimination. His first hire was Jennifer Walsh, who had left Skyline Airways to join United's new passenger rights division. Together, they were developing protocols to ensure that incidents like the one at O'Hare could never happen again. What we learned, Carlos explained during a conference on aviation ethics, is that discrimination thrives in silence. When people are afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge authority, afraid to do what's right because it might cost them their jobs, that's when prejudice becomes policy. Change happens when individuals choose courage over comfort. Dr. Marcus Thompson had leveraged the attention from the incident into something much larger than personal vindication. The Dignity and Travel Foundation had partnered with major civil rights organizations to monitor and address discrimination in transportation industries. They had successfully advocated for federal legislation requiring bias training for all airline personnel, and had created legal support networks for passengers who experienced discrimination. But the Foundation's work extended far beyond aviation. BioNova Therapeutics had become a leader in ensuring that medical innovations reached underserved communities, and Marcus used his platform to advocate for equity in healthcare access. The company's patient assistance programs had provided life-saving treatments to over 3,000 patients who couldn't afford them otherwise. The incident at the airport was painful, Marcus reflected during a keynote speech at Harvard Business School, but it taught me something important about privilege and responsibility. When you have a platform, you have a choice. You can use it to benefit yourself, or you can use it to lift others. The real victory isn't in getting revenge on people who wrong you. It's in creating systems that prevent those wrongs from happening to anyone else. Victoria Ashworth had found her own path to redemption through service. Her work with healthcare advocacy organizations had made her an unexpected expert on the intersection of bias and medical care. She spoke regularly at conferences about unconscious prejudice and had developed training programs that were being used in hospitals and clinics across the country. The transformation hadn't been easy. Victoria had endured months of unemployment, public scrutiny, and personal shame before finding her new calling. But she had emerged from the experience with a deeper understanding of her own biases and a commitment to using her story to prevent similar incidents. I spent 15 years thinking I was protecting standards, Victoria said during a TEDx talk that had been viewed over 2 million times. But I was really protecting prejudice. I thought appearance determined worth, and that assumption nearly cost my mother her life. The man I discriminated against became the person who saved her, and that taught me that grace is more powerful than judgment. The ripple effects of that morning at O'Hare continued to spread through unexpected channels. Helen Ashworth had become an advocate for rare disease patients, using her story to demonstrate the importance of medical research funding. She worked closely with BioNova's Patient Foundation, helping other families navigate the complexities of accessing experimental treatments. Robert Hayes had parlayed his citizen journalism into a career focused on social justice documentation. His live stream of the airport incident had shown the power of real-time accountability, and he now worked with organizations across the country to train people in effective protest documentation and civil rights advocacy. The broader conversation about discrimination in service industries had led to policy changes far beyond aviation. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and other customer-facing businesses had implemented new training programs and oversight programs. The phrase Gate B23 moment had entered the corporate lexicon as shorthand for discrimination incidents that could destroy a company's reputation. But perhaps the most important legacy was the personal growth that had emerged from the crisis. Marcus had learned to use his success as a platform for justice. Victoria had learned that prejudice diminishes both the victim and the perpetrator. Carlos and Jennifer had learned that moral courage could transform careers. And millions of people who had watched the story unfold had been reminded that dignity is not negotiable. As Marcus stood in his office overlooking the Chicago skyline reviewing the latest data on patients who had received life-saving treatments through BioNova's assistance programs, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A single act of discrimination had sparked a global conversation about bias, justice, and human dignity. A moment of humiliation had become a catalyst for healing and reform. His phone buzzed with a text message from Carlos Martinez. 1-year anniversary of Gate B23 tomorrow. United is implementing new passenger rights training program. Thank you for showing us that dignity always wins in the end. Marcus smiled and typed back, "Thank you for showing us that speaking up always matters even when it costs something." That's how change really happens. The story that had begun with hatred had ended with healing. The prejudice that was meant to exclude had instead included millions of people in a conversation about justice. And the woman who had tried to deny a black man his rightful place had ultimately learned that dignity belongs to everyone, regardless of appearance, background, or status. Sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that operates on a timeline we can't see and through mechanisms we don't expect. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the most important changes. And sometimes the people who try to diminish us end up elevating us to platforms where our voices can reach further than we ever imagined. The incident at Gate B23 was over. The movement it had started was just beginning. If this story moved you, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button to help this message reach more people who need to hear it. Stories about dignity and justice deserve to be shared widely, and your engagement helps make that happen. Second, subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. We're committed to bringing you more true stories that matter, stories that remind us of our shared humanity and inspire us to treat each other better. Every subscription helps us reach new audiences with these important messages. And third, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Whether it's a friend who's faced discrimination, a family member who needs to understand the impact of bias, or a colleague who could benefit from this lesson about character and consequences, your share could change someone's perspective. Remember, every time we choose dignity over discrimination, every time we speak up, instead of staying silent, every time we show grace instead of seeking revenge, we make the world a little more just for everyone. True first-class treatment isn't about where you sit on a plane, it's about how we treat each other as human beings. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of a community that believes in justice, dignity, and hope. We'll see you in the next story that reminds us why character always matters more than circumstances.